Yeah. Hello, guys. I hope you had a great day. But I think we can go ahead and start. So today we'll talk about document object model, which is basically an interface that allows you to manipulate your like your HTML file, like HTML elements. Um, so so the basic agenda for this meeting is that like during the first 10 minutes, I'll go over what is document object model, and I'll also talk about what an API is, and also like a little bit of like REST API, and then we'll basically work on a small web application that makes a request to the third party and get some data and then display that nicely to the end user. So I can actually, yeah, so I think we can just go ahead and start. Let's see. Okay. And let me know if you have any questions while I'm presenting. You can like unmute yourself, or you can also like post your question in the chat box. Um, so you probably have heard of like API being mentioned in your computer science courses, uh, but um, but API is basically this. So API stands for Application Programming Interface, and it is basically this tool or software that allows your software to talk to other softwares, right? So it allows developers to abstract away complex code and make it available to use for other people. So it lets you access data from third party. Um, so if we use an analogy of like restaurant server, um, let's say so in a restaurant we usually have customers, right? So as a customer and I want to make some order, so I'll the waiter is going to come to me, and then I'll basically communicate my order, and the waiter or waitress can basically like go to the kitchen and get my order ready, right? So in this case, the waiter or waitress is the API, and me as a customer, I'm the client, which is basically the browser, right? So um, and the kitchen is like the server, which processes everything and like communicates with the database and then like sends responses when some request comes in, right? So in this case, I as a customer, I don't have to like directly go to the kitchen myself and get my order. I have this waiter which I can like um, use to like communicate my requests or orders with the restaurant. Um, yeah, so that's like a simplest like analogy of what an API is. And one of the really commonly used or popular form of API is called REST API, and it is very commonly used um, amongst like companies like Google or YouTube or any companies, and like sending their data from server to the client browser. So let's say let's say Facebook, right? So if you make a like if you just go to the Facebook page and you type in your URL in the browser, it's gonna automatically create a GET request, which is a type of RESTful API, and it's gonna make a request to their server and retrieves all the posts that corresponds to you as a user, right? So it basically gets all the posts for your feeds, and then it's gonna send that back to your browser, and then your browser is gonna display those information nicely, right? Um, yeah, so API is like really commonly used amongst like different applications. Um, so now let's go ahead and watch a video that I think does a better job explaining what an API is, application to connect with other applications, right? Um, so today we'll basically use this browser API called Fetch API, which basically allows us to make HTTP requests to servers from our browsers. So so RESTful API is a type of API that is like really commonly used when communicating between like servers to browsers. And so by default, the fetch API uses the get method, which is basically like a read, so which basically reads some type of data, and there are like three other methods. There's like post method, which lets you write to the database, and there's the put, which lets you to update, and there's also delete. So by default, if you were to pass in your URL to the fetch API, it's gonna use the get method. So you don't have to provide what type of method you're using when we're making your request. And we're also gonna be using the async await syntax. So I can definitely like go more deeper into the JavaScript promises, but it's gonna take so they're kind of like should be we should definitely spend another meeting to talk about JavaScript promises. So basically what you need to remember is that if you want to use this syntax over here, which looks really like synchronous. So it's almost like this, it's almost like every statement gets executed in order, um, which is different from this this syntax over here. But basically what you need to remember is that if you want to use the async await, like using await keyword before fetch, then you need to put async keyword before your function. Yeah. And so now let's talk about document object model, which is another type of interface or API provided by your browser. So document object model is basically a tree of nodes or elements created by the browser, and it lets you use JavaScript to manipulate the DOM. So at the top, we basically have this document object, and under that, we basically have the HTML element, and under that, we have the header tag, and the body tag. So you can almost treat all of your HTML elements or tags as a node, and it is represented in this hierarchical tree of nodes. Yeah. So actually, the highest node in this hierarchy is actually the window object, which sits on top of the document. So, but in this meeting, we're just going to use the document to manipulate the DOM. So to get started, you can visit this GitHub repos. And since we haven't went over Git, you can just install this or download this folder as a zip file. So if you click on the clone button drop down over here, and you can select this option of like download as zip, and then it should basically download this repository as a zip folder or file, and then you can like unzip it, and then you can open up your WebStorm or any text editors of your choice, and then just go into that directory. And I'll give you guys a minute to do that. Yep, definitely. Let me actually do that. So, 1 second.
I got it.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, thanks. So while you guys are um, installing the repos, let me just quickly demo how the application is going to work. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, so we're basically building this really simple web application that uses a third-party API and make a request and basically get that request and display that on the browser over here. So we're basically using this API that generates some random activity based on the type of activity that we provide. So over here, if we select social and click on this button, and that's gonna make a GET request using the fetch API, and we're just gonna get that data and put that on our browser using the DOM API. So if I do this, here we have an activity of like playing a game of tennis with a friend. And if I click this again, it's going to make another request and display that, like overwrite the overwrite the DOM. So if I were to select relaxation, then it's going to get me a different activity to do. So if I were to open up my developers tool and inspect this, so I can go to the network tab and see all the API requests that are being made. So if I do this, then over here, I can see that there was this API request that was made, and it has a status of 200, which means okay or successful in a REST API. And if I were to look at the preview, so this is the response that I got in a JSON format. So we have like accessibility, activity type, the key, which is like, I guess, a unique ID. And it also shows number of participants and price. And it's also telling me like which line in this main.js file it is making, like this request was made. And this is the header. So this is like the, yeah, these are like other types of meta information about the response. And this is the request that I made. So I just needed to like pass in the URL without using all these options because these are kind of like the default. But yeah, you can always go to the network tab and retrieve all kinds of like network requests information. And this is my document object model. So over here, I basically have this form, which allows me to select an option, which is shown over here. So I basically have this HTML form tag or element, and then inside that, I basically have the select input, and I can select from social to music. So there's like 5 or 6 options for me to choose from. So this is how we're gonna get the selection to pass into the get API request. Okay, so with that, I hope you guys were able to successfully install the zip folder. Let's see. Okay. Yeah. So first of all, we're just gonna go over some of the functions you can use to like use the document object model. So we basically have this HTML file called cheat sheet, and we also have a JavaScript file called cheatsheet.js. So if you open up this cheat sheet.html file on your browser. So it is linked with the cheat sheet.js. So you can just right click on this file and copy its absolute path. And then you can open up Chrome or any other browser of your choice. And then to file colon, triple backslash, and then just paste it, and it should open up your cheat sheet.html file. And then I can just go to the console to see the output of my JavaScript file, right? So let me just finish this. Okay. So I guess the good starting point is to just examine the document object. So if we were to console dir, so dir stands for directory, which basically collapses the value that we pass in instead of like just logging everything. But if we use like dir and then refresh our browser, as you can see, we can see all the properties of this JavaScript object document. So there's like so many properties like functions. So yeah, so this basically allows developers to manipulate the document object with all these functions. But we're just gonna look at a few functions that are most frequently used. Yeah, and we can also log the URL property, the title, as well as the body. So let's try that. So the URL of our of this browser tab is this here, which is correct. And we can also get the title of this web page, right? So title, if you remember from our HTML meeting, you can specify the title of a web page by using a title element or tag inside the header tag. So you can put all kinds of like meta information inside the header tag. So this is what it's logging over here. And you can also use document.body to have access to the body elements. So body element includes everything that you're actually displaying on your browser, right? So we basically have a heading tags, and we have two paragraph elements of some dummy text, and we also have this button. Yeah, so that's basically everything. Yeah. Okay, so we can also change the title of this document. So before it was JavaScript DOM, but if we were to change this, refresh. Yeah, so if you take a look over here, then it has a new title right? And we can also just log the title again. Let's say document.title. Yeah, now it's logging a different title. Okay. So let me just comment these out. Okay. Yeah. So there are like three ways for you to select HTML elements using JavaScript. So the first way is selecting element by their ID. So if you remember from our CSS meeting, ID is basically a type of attribute that you can that lets you specify a unique element. So you can only have one ID per element within the web page. So you can't use multiple IDs for like different elements. So an ID has to be like unique within your web page, right? HTML document. So if you look at the HTML document, we basically have this this paragraph, which is the first paragraph, and it has an ID of par 1. So if we want to select this element over here, then what we can do is we can use the get element by ID function and pass in the string argument of the ID, and then just so if we try to console log this, we can actually see its contents. Yeah. So it is logging the paragraph element with an ID of paragraph 1. So this is one way for you to select elements using JavaScript. So you can also like update the content of an HTML element by using the inner HTML property. So if you want to change the text or the content of this paragraph element, you can use paragraph1.innerHTML is equal to and type in a new content. So if you were to do that and refresh your web page, then boom, it's gonna show the updated text for the paragraph. And the second way of getting your HTML elements is using the class name. So if you remember from our CSS meeting, you can have classes. You can like add the same class to multiple elements within an HTML document. So over here, we basically have this h1 class for the h1 element, and we can get this element by doing using the get element by class name, get elements, which is plural. So we can use this function, and this is going to return a list of HTML elements. So in order for us to get one element, we have to specify the we have to like get that element from the array like collection of nodes. So in this case, we can do h1 bracket and specify the index, which is, so we just want to get the first element in this collection, and then we can do inner HTML. So yeah, like before we actually update the content, let's just log this. So if we do this, as you can see, it is returning an HTML collection. So it's like an array. And the first element is, so this is the first element. So if we want to update the content of this, what we can do is using the inner HTML property. So before it was JavaScript cheat sheet, and now it becomes heading 1. And we can also get the elements by their element name or tag name. So we can get all the paragraph elements by using the get elements by tag name function, and we can pass in the name of the element, which is a paragraph. And then if we do this, then it should give us the collection of, yeah. So it gave us the first paragraph, which has an ID of paragraph 1. And let's see. Yeah, and the second paragraph, which doesn't have any ID. Yeah. And if we want to change the content of all the paragraphs, then we can just use a for loop to update their content using inner HTML. So now all the paragraph has been changed to hello world. Okay. So we can also select element using this function called query selector. So this function basically allows us to select elements by their ID, their class name, or their element name, the tag name. So the only difference is that you need to specify what kind of like which method you're using, right? So if you're selecting element by their ID, you need to add a number sign. And if it is a class selector, then you need to like add a period. And if it's just the element name or the tag name, then you don't need to add anything. Let's see. Yeah, so the query selector function only retrieves the first element that matches this. But if you want to get all the elements that matches the selector, then you can use the query select all methods or function. So let's just try that. So the first one is using query select, and it's passing a number sign paragraph 1, and it is returning the first paragraph. And the second one is getting, let's see. Yeah, let's console log this. Yeah, the second one is getting all the elements with a class of H1. Sorry, the first matching element, not all the elements. And the third one is getting the first matching element that has a element name of paragraph. And the last one is selecting all the elements within tag name or paragraph, so it returns a node list. Yeah. And we can also like bind some kind of action or function to JavaScript events. So events in JavaScript are basically some kind of user action. So in this case, what we want to do is that if a user were to click on this button, then we want to trigger some kind of alert over here, right? Like pop-up alert. So in that case, we basically create this function called alert pop-up, and it basically uses the alert function provided by the window object. So this is the same as using window.alert. So you can just take this, get rid of this. And we basically select this button using the query selector with a tag name of button. So it's this thing over here. And then we can add an event listener by using the event listener function. And then we can specify the type of event that we wanted to listen to. And then we can pass in the function that should get triggered. So if we were to refresh our browser and click on this button, and it's going to trigger our function, we're just going to show a pop-up alert. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Okay, yeah, let's see. Yeah, so now let's work on our simple application. So I'm already like providing the template for you guys, so you don't have to worry about writing the HTML or the CSS. For the CSS, I didn't like write any CSS. I'm just using a popular CSS framework called Bootstrap. So I'm basically including the external link of the CSS file over here. So I'm just using the classes within that framework to get my CSS, to like add my CSS, right? But let me just open up this index.html file on my browser. So I'm gonna copy its absolute path. Let's do file : / paste it. Okay. Yeah. So right now, so this doesn't work. So I can select different options, but if I click this, it's gonna refresh and it doesn't really work, right? So we're basically gonna like fill in the blank for the main.js file, which is responsible for making the request to the API and manipulating the DOM. So at the bottom of the index.html, we have linked the main.js file. So we're just going to work on this main.js file here. Give me one moment. Okay. All right. Yeah. So the API that we're going to work with is called so it's called board API. So it basically returns some kind of activity based on the parameter that you provide. Let's see. So if I were to make a request without passing in any arguments, then it's just gonna give me like some kind of random activity. But if I were to provide the type of activity, let's say recreational, let me look at the document. Let's see, type. Okay, yeah, yeah. So whenever you want to pass in some kind of parameter arguments, you need to use the question mark, and then you need to specify the name of your argument, and then you can use add an equal sign and pass in the value. So the next argument that you want to add, I think you can just use the and sign. But if we just do this, then it's returning a random activity that has a type of recreational. And I think we can also do music. Yeah. So yeah, for this application, I'm just using the activity type parameter, but there are also like other parameter that you can pass in, such as the number of participants. Yeah. But oh yeah. So this basically provides us with all the options that are available for the type. So I think like at the time when I was building this application, like last year, the only type for the activity is like the 5 that you can see over here. So I guess they've updated it since then. But yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we basically have this get activity function that is going to make a request to this API and get some data, and then it's gonna put that data within our HTML document. So the first step that we need to take is getting the activity type value from the select field. So if you take a look at the index.html, we basically have this form element with the select input, and we have a bunch of options, right? So the way I would go about doing this is that I would basically get the form itself using the get element by ID. Let me actually split this. Yeah, let me know if I can like actually like increase the font size for you guys so like easier to see. Yeah, so basically I'm getting the this form element by using the get element by ID function. Um, and then I can get the selected value, like selected user fields by doing const activity type. And then I can do form. And then I can pass in the name of the select field. So the name will be the name over here, right? So I can do activity type, and then I can get the value property to get the value that is being selected. So that could be social, relaxation, or busy work. So if you don't do this, if you don't do the value, then what you're gonna get is a HTML element, which is the whole thing over here. So it should be the all of this thing. But we only want to get the string value that is actually selected. So so I can actually log the activity type. So let's try that. Let me open up my console and let's refresh. So if I were to select social and then execute this function, so as you can see, it is not working. And the reason is because, so like one thing you may have noticed is that it is like refreshing the browser, right? So this is due to a default behavior of the submit. So when you're like submitting a form, it's basically, so this is kind of like the default behavior, but the problem is we haven't added the event listener for the submit event. So what we need to do is we can go to the bottom of this function, and then we can use add event listener, and we're going to listen for the submit events. And then we can specify the function that should get invoked whenever this form is being submitted. So let's try that. Let's refresh our browser and let's try this again. Okay, now it is actually working. So if I were to select a different option, then it is gonna give me the corresponding results, right? So now we know that it is working, so we can just use this value and pass that in when we make a GET request to this board API. Okay, let's see. So now we need to make a request. So I'm creating this variable called response. So since I'm using the Fetch API with async await syntax, I need to add a keyword of await, and then I can just do Fetch API, and I'm gonna pass in the API endpoint by using template literal. So I'm using backtick, so I can like inject some kind of inject JavaScript directly into the string. So I think the whole so this is like the code for this. So so the URL for this is just boredom.com API activity, and then we're specifying type. So we're getting the type from the option that the user selected. So I'm using string JavaScript template literal to inject some kind of JavaScript variable. So if I do that, this is going to return me a promise, and then I need to turn that into a JSON format, which I can actually use. So this is not getting me the data itself, so I need to also convert that to its JSON format. So if I do this, And if I try to log my data, let's see what we get. So if I select social and make this request, then this is the data that I'm getting. So it is a JavaScript object because we're using the, we have like converted our response to a JSON format. And if we select a different type, then we get corresponding activity. So this has a type of relaxation. Okay. So the next step will be destructuring some of these field so we can display that in our browser. So the properties that I'm using are just the activity name, number of participants, and the type. So over here, I basically have a template. So I basically have this UI element that is using template literal. So I'm just going to destructure the data that I want to get used from this data variable, and then I'm going to inject that into these list elements over here. So if I take a look at this again, we need to retrieve the type property, the participant, and the activity type. So I'm going to use JavaScript variable destructuring. So I can just do const brackets. I can specify the activity, like the properties that I want to retrieve. So there's activity, there's participants, and I think there's one more. Yeah, the type. And I can set that equal to data variable. So this is literally the same thing as doing like activity is equal to data.activity. So these two are the same. So after I do that, I can just pass these in using template literal. So I can use money sign, just inject these. Okay. Okay. So the next step will be injecting our activity data into the HTML card elements using template literal. So this element that you see over here, give me a moment. So right now I'm opening the deployed application. So it's just this this card element that you see over here. So I can like close it, and I can, yeah. So we're just like putting the data that we get from the API, and then we're just injecting those variables. So we can put this into our the document, HTML document. So now the next step would be just injecting this HTML card element to part of our document, to our HTML document. So what I'm gonna do is so if you take a look at the index.html, we basically have this div with an ID of output, right? So this is where we want to put our calculated, like the result. So I'm gonna select this using get element by ID. And I'm gonna put that outside of this try and catch clause just so I can use this twice within the try clause and the catch clause. So I'm gonna create a variable called output div, and I'm gonna select the using get element by ID function, and the ID should be output. Okay. Then I'm gonna use the inner HTML methods to just put the output like this. And if I get some kind of error, then I'm just gonna override this output div with this div of like alert danger. So this is like a red box, and I'm also gonna throw an error text, and also like pass in the status text of this error. So I'm only gonna get this error when my API request fails, and it fails when the data that like maybe the argument that I provide over here, it doesn't match the type of arguments that are like valid. So I can also test that out. But right now, let's just try this, and this should work. So if it works. So if if I click on this button, it's gonna make a request. And we know that is working when we're like console logging the data, right? So now it should basically populate the results into our HTML document. So let's try that. Okay, yeah, it is working. And the second time that we click, it's basically overriding the existing HTML element. So that's what's going on. Okay, so let's actually try to maybe like trigger this error. So I think one way to trigger that error will be just pass in some random string for the type. So if we try that, so we're getting undefined. So I guess it is not returning a response with like error text. Yeah, I wonder how to trigger it. Yeah, maybe we can just pass in like some kind of random endpoint. Maybe that will work. Yeah, I think that should work. No. Okay. Yeah, let me check the network tab. Is it returning 200? Yes. Yeah, so that's kind of weird. So even though I'm getting like, I'm using a wrong endpoint, it is returning 200, which means successful. So ideally, if it returns anything other than 200, then it should basically logs an error. But yeah, maybe I'm missing something. Yeah. So the last thing that we need to do is basically being able to close this modal, right? So if I were to click this, it should basically remove this modal. So we can do that by using the remove method of the DOM. So we're just going to select the card element. So we're selecting this. Yeah. So we're basically selecting this element with a class name of card. So we're using document.query selector, and then we're passing in the class name, and we need to put a period because we're using a class name. So let's just do DOM, and then we're gonna call the remove method, which is gonna remove that from our tree of DOMs, from our documents, HTML document. And we also need to bind this function to the onClick event. which we do over here. So we can also just have this attribute of onClick and specify the function that should get invoked. So if we go back, we should be able to close it. Yes, cool. Awesome. Yeah, that's basically all the functionality of the application. I'm sure you can like expand it by maybe like retrieving the result using different parameters like number of participants, and that's something maybe like you can extend upon. But yeah, so today we talked about the making a fetch request, making a RESTful request using the fetch API, and we also talked about using document object model to manipulate your HTML document. So now you should be able to build a simple front-end application by making HTTP requests to any kinds of like backend servers and just display that nicely on your browser. So that's pretty much everything a front-end developer should be able to do. And you can definitely use like different JavaScript frameworks like React and Angular or Vue to like basically make that work, make that job simpler. So without using DOM, you can also use a framework, but developers should be able to use DOM because that's like because you know like the ins and outs of like what's going on under the hood, right? So yeah, let's see. So if you want to look at some other different APIs, I think you can just do free JavaScript APIs, GitHub. Yeah, I think there's this repos with like a bunch of really cool APIs, and most of them are free, so you can just use these to build a simple application similar to what I did over here. Yeah, so I'm gonna put this in the chat box so you can explore on your own time. But yeah, so I hope you guys learned the basics of like DOM and fetch API. And I think the next meeting we're gonna talk about Git and GitHub. But yeah, let me know if you had any questions. But with that, I hope you have good rest of your evening, and I hope to see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.